Hello, and welcome to Medical Center Hour. This is the University of Virginia's weekly public forum on medicine, healthcare, and society. I'm Marcia Day Childress from the Center for Health Humanities and Ethics in the School of Medicine. Thank you so much for joining us today, indeed, every Wednesday. The slides that open and close this program offer resources, information about continuing health professional education credit, and a link to UVA Bookstore. There's also a link to our center's website with more information about today's speaker, our February program lineup, and Medical Center Hour videos available on our YouTube channel. Today's program is being recorded and closed captioned and will be posted to YouTube. On Zoom, we handle audience contributions using the Q&A function. Please write your questions and comments there. We'll monitor the questions throughout the presentation and make them the focus of our discussion at the close of the hour. This is one of Medical Center Hour's History of the Health Sciences lectures, which probe the past to better understand today and tomorrow. Not quite 2 centuries ago, the idea of a woman doctor was anathema in this country, simply unacceptable to the male medical establishment and also to many sectors of society. And yet, Elizabeth Blackwell persisted. In 1849, Elizabeth Blackwell became Dr. Blackwell, the first woman in the United States to receive an MD. 5 years later, her sister Emily followed Elizabeth's iconic example. Together, they embarked on the hard work of bringing medical care to women and children in a New York City hospital staffed entirely by women. In so doing, they charted pathways for other women into medicine, paths that today are broad, variegated, and crowded with talented, tenacious women. What would the Doctors Blackwell say if they knew that in 2019, for the first time, women made up the majority of US medical school students? Or that 60% of practicing physicians under 35 in the United States today are women? So who were the Doctors Blackwell, the sisters who set these trends in motion, who brought medicine to women, but also women into medicine? There's no better person to address these questions today than Janice Nimura, New York City-based author of The Doctors Blackwell, a brand new biography out just 2 weeks ago and offering a new look at these pioneering women physicians. We're so fortunate to have engaged Janice to talk with us today. She and her book have been much in the media. Just last evening, in fact, she spoke at a program alongside another pioneering woman in medicine, UVA's medical alumna, Dr. Vivian Pinn, who coincidentally in 1995 received the American Medical Women's Association's Elizabeth Blackwell Medal. I'd like to thank Historical Collections and the Health Sciences Library for being our partner on this program. And now I'll turn things over to Janice Nimura, who will introduce all of us to the Doctors Blackwell. Welcome, Janice.
Thank you so much, Marcia, and to everyone at UVA who's sharing their lunch hour with me. I appreciate you. I'm going to put up some pictures and we'll be off to the races. It's really an honor to be doing this for such a, this is the ultimate audience right here, a medical humanities audience. So thank you for joining us. Okay, so as Marcia said, the Blackwells, if you have, in a medical community, I don't encounter quite as many people who have never heard the name, but you'd be astonished at how many people, including myself, had never heard it until recently. If you know the name of Blackwell, you probably are familiar with Elizabeth, and the phrase first woman doctor immediately pops into your mind. As Marcia said, first woman to receive an American medical degree in 1849, and her sister, Emily, 5 years younger, in 1854. Together, they founded the New York Infirmary for Indigent Women and Children, and then the Women's Medical College of the New York Infirmary. I encountered the Blackwell story for the first time 5 years ago. This was despite the fact that I am born and raised in New York City, where they lived and practiced, that I had attended a proudly feminist all-girls school from the age of 5, that I was the math science kid at that school and graduated from it with the full intention of pursuing medicine in college. I was later seduced by the humanities, but that's another story. How was it possible that I had never heard of them? So I went looking. And it turns out that the Blackwell story tends to be easiest to find on the children's biography shelf. This is an edition from the 40s. There's always a slim, attractive, well-dressed woman bending solicitously over a patient with a stethoscope. Here's the middle grade version from my daughter's school library. Same attractive young woman with a stethoscope, grateful patient. Here's the picture book version, a much younger girl, but there's the stethoscope waiting to come into use. These stories were incomplete, it seemed. The Blackwells looked like this. They were never photographed holding stethoscopes. And even if they had been in the 1840s and 50s, when they were the age of the women featured in these children's books, stethoscopes would have looked more like this, monaural instead of the kind that we are more familiar with today. The children's versions were sanitized. They almost always featured Elizabeth. I wanted to know what this story was in all its complexity, with all its ragged edges, not as a story of perky, pretty, inspirational young woman. I wanted more. So I went into the archives. There were 9 Blackwell siblings, and they were rarely in the same place at the same time. So there were mountains and mountains of material, much of which looked like this, which is what letters looked like in the early 19th century when paper and postage were dear. You filled the page and then you turned it 90 degrees and you filled it again. You learn how to read this kind of writing very quickly, but it is a little eye-popping when you first encounter it. And as I went more deeply into the archives, I began to get a picture of 2 women who were much more complicated than those children's books. So what is this story, briefly? The Blackwells, 8 out of the 9 of them, were born in Bristol, England, and they came to this country as children in 1832. They were the daughters and sons of a paradox. Their father was a sugar refiner and an ardent abolitionist. Think about that for a second. He had profited from a commodity that was dependent on enslaved labor, but his dream was to find a way to make that commodity, sugar, out of sugar beets, not cane, in the North and not with enslaved labor. So on the strength of that dream, he moved them all the way from Bristol to New York and then all the way out to the frontier town of Cincinnati in 1832, hoping to find a way to do this. And then barely having unpacked in Cincinnati, he died broke, leaving his widow and 9 small children with $20. His final lesson to his children, especially his daughters, was that a husband is no guarantee of security. He had, however, endowed his children with the same education, daughters and sons, unusually. So his first 3 children, who were all daughters, snapped into action and went to work as teachers. None of his 5 daughters ever married. Elizabeth was born in 1821, 200 years ago and 1 week today, on February 3rd. She was voraciously brilliant, socially quite awkward, blessed with a healthy ego, and an admirer of people like Margaret Fuller, the transcendentalist editor and writer, who had a bestseller out in the middle of the 1840s called Woman in the 19th Century. And in that book, Margaret Fuller argued that humanity was not going to rise to any new level of enlightenment until women proved their powers, until women proved that they could be whatever they wanted to be. It was a matter of talent and toil. It had nothing to do with sex. Women could be sea captains if they wanted to. And Elizabeth, reading this book, it really resonated with her, this idea, and she began to think that maybe her life could be the kind of life that proved Margaret Fuller's point. She really saw herself as the kind of person whose example could lead humanity toward the light. She thought big. So she chose medicine rather strategically, not because she loved science or wanted to heal the sick. She sort of thought sickness was a sign of weakness and bodily functions were disgusting. She much preferred the life of the mind. But medicine in this moment was an unusually clear way to prove the point that she wanted to make. It was redefining itself as a field, both scientifically and institutionally. To this point, it had been considered more of a trade. Midwives, barber surgeons, country doctors who got their training by following other country doctors around. But recently in America, it had become more the case that it was a profession of men who had won their credentials by going to a medical school. And there were increasingly more medical schools in America. So it occurred to Elizabeth that if she found her way into a medical school and attended all the lectures and passed all the examinations, who could say that she wasn't qualified to be a doctor? And as this 1825 cartoon suggests, medical school at this point was not terribly rigorous. It was known as what you did if you weren't smart enough to go into the law. It had no resemblance to the incredibly challenging academic feat that medical school is today. Basically, it consisted of two 16-week terms that were identical to each other. You just repeated them 1 year after the next. In the middle, you went off and tried to get some practical training somewhere. The lectures were it. If you were lucky, you got to watch some dissection. If you were really lucky, you got to perform some yourself. But generally, you graduated from medical school after 2 years, never having touched a living patient. With an alarming degree of ignorance. It wasn't a huge challenge to get that medical degree at this point. So at the age of 26, Elizabeth won admission to a tiny rural medical school in Geneva, New York, in the Finger Lakes of Western New York State. Geneva College has since evolved into Hobart and William Smith colleges. The building on the left, which no longer stands, housed the medical department, and on the right is the spot where it used to be. The story of her admission is an interesting one. In her memoir, written half a century later, she tells it the way you might imagine. You know, I tried and tried. I was rejected many times. I received a letter that finally granted me admission, and off I went. In the appendix to her book, though, interestingly, she allows another voice to tell a different story. Her classmate, Stephen Smith, who went on to be a prominent physician in New York City, remembered it differently. What happened was Elizabeth had been studying in Philadelphia with a rather prominent physician who had written her a letter of endorsement to Geneva College. And the faculty at Geneva weren't quite bold enough to reject this prominent physician's endorsement out of hand. So instead, they punted the question to their students. This is a bunch of, 100 boisterous provincial boys. And they said, okay, boys, this woman wants to come study with us, which is outrageous. What kind of a woman would want to study the processes of the body alongside men? Appalling. We will leave the question to you, students, but if any one of you rejects this idea, it won't happen. They thought they were safe. The students, though, recognizing the opportunity for some serious fun, and also recognizing that their professors hadn't been bold enough to shut this down themselves, had a meeting that night and unanimously decided to admit this woman. They assumed it was a joke. They thought maybe it was a prank cooked up by a local rival medical school. And then they forgot all about it until 3 weeks later when Elizabeth Blackwell walked into the lecture hall. Once admitted, she found herself able to learn from specimens instead of just books, warming more and more to the subject of medicine. And she also quickly earned the respect of her fellow students who realized that she was about to leave them all in the dust academically. She quickly rose to the top of the class. Between those two terms, those two winter terms, she went back to Philadelphia for the summer and found her way to Blockley Almshouse, then the largest municipal hospital in the country. Someone referred to it as a warehouse for the destitute. This was a place where you ended up as a last resort. It was a great place to observe illness, perhaps not such a great place to actually learn healing. But Elizabeth moved in to a room that was located off the syphilis ward. I'm assuming since this is largely a medical community, you will be okay with this next slide. Forgive me if you're in the middle of your lunch, but tertiary syphilis in that era, if you got to the place where you were actually hospitalized with it, was a horrifying prospect. Syphilitic necrosis eating away at your skull. There was a characteristic profile known as saddle nose that syphilitics were known to have when the bridge of the nose caved in. From having no practical experience with patients, Elizabeth suddenly had more than she could handle in some ways. And a sudden exposure to the idea of the connection between poverty and disease. You know, that she was coming to medicine at a moment of real change. She was learning from her professors that things like venereal disease were a result of licentious behavior, not germs, but at the same time, she could see that hygiene was in play in a way that she wasn't necessarily learning in the classroom. She started to think about all these ideas. She also was exposed at Blockley to epidemic disease. This was 1848, her summer there. Waves of Irish refugees were arriving from the Great Famine, carrying typhus, also known as ship fever. They overflowed the wards of Blockley Almshouse, another very graphic example for her of a different kind of disease. Although again, she had been learning in her class that fear was often what predisposed people to epidemic infection. And she began to think about what she was seeing versus what she was hearing in class. She ended up writing her thesis on ship fever and graduating at the top of her class, whereupon that thesis was published in the Buffalo Medical Journal as the lead article. You get a sense of what a star she was. I think it's interesting that she chose a thesis topic that was not gendered in any way. She didn't do her work on women or on diseases of women or on obstetrics, but on something that was gender neutral. Then, having graduated with flying colors from Geneva College, she needed some practical training. So off she went to Paris, where she ensconced herself at a large public maternity hospital. This was an interesting move. This is a woman who has already won her medical degree, and she finds herself in a hospital for the training of midwives. This was a municipal hospital in Paris that attracted women from all over the country to come and train and then go back to the provinces to work as midwives. Elizabeth decided to become a student in this hospital for the volume of obstetric cases that she'd be able to see. There, she suffered a catastrophe that changed the shape of her career, if not its direction. I mentioned this was a public maternity hospital. If you were delivering a baby in a hospital, it meant that you were destitute. Any woman with a little bit of money would have delivered at home. And so many of these women were themselves prostitutes, often infected, again, with venereal disease. Elizabeth was tending to the infant of one of these mothers, a baby that had contracted gonorrheal conjunctivitis from passing through the birth canal of an infected mother. Elizabeth was syringing its infected eye when some of the washing liquid splashed into her own face, and she herself contracted gonorrheal conjunctivitis. Today, while not a joke, it wouldn't be cause for too much concern in the age of antibiotics, but at the time, it was catastrophic. She was immediately confined to bed in the hospital where she had been working, and for weeks lay in doubt of whether she would see again. This is an interesting moment to pause and sort of reflect on what it's like to try and tell stories from all of these sources. What my job was, Elizabeth was under the care of one of the attending physicians at La Maternité during her illness, the wonderfully named Hippolyte Blot, who she had befriended, and they had a warm friendship. And this was how she described her illness in his care in her memoir decades later. "Ah, how dreadful it was to find the daylight gradually fading as my kind doctor bent over me and removed with an exquisite delicacy of touch the films that had formed over the pupil. I could see him for a moment clearly, but the sight soon vanished and the eye was left in darkness." It sort of sounds like a romance novel. At the same time, also in Paris, coincidentally at this moment, and luckily, was Elizabeth's eldest sister, Anna Blackwell. Anna as this pose wonderfully suggests, was a Class A drama queen and a journalist. And she happened to be in Paris, and so she joined in taking care of her sister and writing home all of the gory details to the Blackwells in America, waiting to find out what was going to happen to Elizabeth. This is how she wrote about it in one of her letters home. The pupil presents just now the appearance of one of those little misshapen blackberries of 3 granulations and half dried up that one sees so often on some scrubby little bush. If you can fancy one such in dull-looking lead, you have just the appearance of this poor eye. This poor eye, indeed. Elizabeth eventually lost one eye, was fitted for a glass prosthetic that she wore for the rest of her life. If you look closely at this image, you can kind of see that there's an asymmetry in her gaze. She never mentioned it to anyone. There were people that never realized that she had only one eye, but it did change how she could approach the field of medicine. It shifted her more and more toward ideas about public health and away from practice. Surgery was now closed to her. Even reading was occasionally difficult. But did she go home to America and convalesce? No, this is Elizabeth Blackwell, a more determined and powerful woman than any I've ever met. She continued on after she finished recovering to London, to St. Bartholomew's Hospital, another public hospital, to continue her training. And there she met a very fateful acquaintance who you might recognize. Florence Nightingale had mutual friends introduced them. This is 1851. So Florence Nightingale is not yet Florence Nightingale. She is the wealthy and frustrated daughter of a middle-class family who really wants her to settle down and get married. Florence Nightingale has other ideas, and meeting Elizabeth Blackwell is this extraordinary moment of communion because Nightingale, who's struggling against middle-class expectations and wanting to launch herself into a career in healthcare and hygiene, meets Elizabeth, who has left her own family behind, gotten a medical degree, is ranging all over Europe training. It's a very exciting friendship for both of them to a point. They quickly realize after they've shared some days together, there's a fundamental difference in how they see the role of women in medicine. And it's a difference they never quite managed to reconcile. Florence Nightingale believes that women's role in health is as nurses. And Elizabeth really believes that women have the role of proving that women can be doctors. Even though Elizabeth watches Nightingale very closely as she rises to global fame, and actually uses a lot of her ideas about hygiene and public health in her work back in New York. They never quite see eye to eye on this. So after finishing up in London, Elizabeth decides that she will go back to New York and establish a private practice there. She thinks, and her professors had told her to expect that female patients would flock to her as a wonderful way to confide their intimate ailments to somebody who wasn't male. But that's not what happened. She gets to New York and hangs out a shingle, and no one shows up, mostly because the very phrase female physician in 1851-52, when she's trying to establish herself in New York, means someone like this, Madame Rastel, the notorious Fifth Avenue abortionist. This is a caricature from the National Police Gazette of Madame Rastel as a demon eating a baby. A female physician in this moment connoted someone who worked on the wrong side of the law, someone whose patients had a whiff of scandal about them. No self-respecting middle-class lady with the money to choose her own healthcare would go to a female physician. And so no one came, and Elizabeth struggled. Meanwhile, she had actively recruited and anointed her sister Emily, 5 years younger, to follow her into medicine. Elizabeth had recognized that becoming the first woman doctor was going to be a lonely and difficult path, and she wanted company. The Blackwells always kind of held each other in higher esteem than any other humans. So Elizabeth surveyed her 4 sisters and selected Emily, who was the next youngest one and also the most brilliant. And Emily, I think, having grown up being used to listening to her domineering older sisters, and also as someone with a real attraction to the natural sciences, said, okay, I can see that, I'll join you. So she did. She struggled at least as hard to win admission to medical school as Elizabeth had, because after Elizabeth's success, the male medical schools barred their doors ever more tightly. At the same time, female medical colleges had begun to open in response to the growing numbers of women who were interested in medicine. And as long as they were female medical colleges, the men's medical colleges could say, why do you need to come here? Why would you want to come here? You can study medicine among women instead of in mixed company. But Emily didn't want to have a degree that was any less impressive than her sisters. And both sisters had kind of a weak view of these women's medical colleges, thinking of them as mediocre at best. So Emily struggled and finally won herself a spot at Rush in Chicago, where after the first term, the trustees said, please don't come back. We actually are really uncomfortable having a woman here, and we would like you to go away. Thank you. She struggled some more and pivoted to Cleveland Medical School, which has since become Case Western, from which she got her degree in 1854. And then she too needed to go to Europe to get some practical experience. And so she chose Edinburgh, where she became one of the assistants of James Young Simpson, one of the most flamboyant and prominent physicians operating in Britain at the time. He was physician to the Queen. He was a professor at the University of Edinburgh. He had discovered the anesthetic properties of chloroform. He had discovered this by passing a decanter of chloroform around at his dinner table, whereupon he and all his friends burst into hysterical laughter and then passed out under the table. He was a bit of a showman, but also an excellent doctor. I like to think that he enjoyed the shock value of having a woman among his assistants, but at the same time, he taught her a great deal. I, from the beginning of this project, wanted this to be the story of both sisters and not just Elizabeth, first woman doctor. But that said, there is more material about Elizabeth. She wrote more, she published more was written about her. And so sometimes the material on Emily was a little bit thinner, but there were plenty of letters and diaries, and I knew that I'd be able to make her part of this story. One of the things you can do when the material gets a little bit thin is go to the places where your subjects went and walk around where they walked and try to use your senses to feel what they felt. So I went to Edinburgh and had a wonderful time following Emily around and thinking about what she was thinking about. So she was learning about the use of these instruments, a stem pessary, which was useful in cases of uterine prolapse. Simpson's own invention, a uterine sound, which was used to measure the dimensions of the cervix. Simpson was an early adapter of the pelvic exam, which Emily found at first startling, and then became very impressed with his diagnostic abilities. She wrote about all of this home to poor Elizabeth, who was languishing in New York with no patients. You can see on the left side of this letter Emily's sketches of the pessary and the sound. Everything she learned, she was pouring into letters home to teach Elizabeth what she was learning. And then I followed Emily around Edinburgh. This is 52 Queen Street, Simpson's home, which still stands, the only house in the row with an extra story because his household just burst at the seams. He was a very popular man with a huge practice and a large family. The day that I went there to take this picture, the door was open. So in the spirit of following in the footsteps, I walked in. It's actually a drug rehabilitation center now. So I wasn't strictly trespassing on private property, but I wandered around in there until somebody told me to wander out again. But you pick up details when you do that of what someone's life was like. James Young Simpson's initials worked into the banisters of his house. And I could more easily picture all of a sudden Emily walking up this staircase to his consulting rooms each day. And then also think a little bit about Simpson himself. What kind of guy puts his initials in his own staircase? I went to the Royal College of Surgeons and their wonderful pathology museum. If you ever find yourself in Edinburgh, once travel is possible again, they wouldn't let me take photographs, but I was able to do a lot of sketching. On the left, James Young Simpson's pillbox, which says, please return to 52 Queen Street under the lid. On the lower left there, his monaural stethoscopes in ivory and rosewood. I thought maybe Emily had actually used one of those at some point. They even had the decanter that he passed the chloroform around in. So this is the kind of fun stuff that you get to do as a biographer, collect as much physical evidence and artifacts as you can to really imagine what it felt like to be the people you're writing about. So Emily is learning a tremendous amount, and Simpson, although amused by her, was also impressed by her and taught her a great deal. This did not stop her, though, from coming in for the same kind of ridicule, really, that Elizabeth had suffered also and was still suffering. This is a cartoon from the London satirical newspaper Punch from right about the time that Emily was finishing up in Edinburgh. It shows a woman on the right wearing the scandalous bloomer costume of the women's rights activists, with a rather mannish profile and a ridiculous hat, staring through spectacles at the only patient who will consult her, a lapdog, being clutched in the arms of a more conventionally feminine young lady. The accompanying article said something about that women doctors were essentially ridiculous, but I guess you could say they were useful because they'd be able to take good care of their husbands and children, because that was truly what a woman should aspire to. So Emily finishes up in Europe and comes back to join Elizabeth in New York, whereupon they found their infirmary, the New York Infirmary for Indigent Women and Children in 1857. Its first location in a building that still stands as it was on the left and as it is on the right on the corner of Bleecker and Crosby Streets in the East Village, if you've ever spent any time in Manhattan. It was the first hospital staffed by women, and their intention was not just to give indigent women a chance to consult doctors of their own sex, but also to be a place for the slowly growing numbers of female medical graduates to do some of the practical training that was very hard to come by because most hospitals didn't want a woman walking the wards. So now they've reestablished themselves in New York, and they have an institution that they can call their own. And then, as you might expect, as on the eve of the Civil War, the Blackwells have a role to play in that conflict. Right after the first shots are fired in 1861, they call a meeting of their supporters and donors in their own living room, and they draft this appeal, which runs in the New York Times, to the women of New York, and especially to those already engaged in preparing against the time of wounds and sickness in the army. There's all this chaotic energy being directed at the Union effort, and they need to organize it and channel it. And so they invite women who want to make it to contribute to come to a meeting at Cooper Union, another building that still stands here, and get organized. And so in response to that appeal, thousands of women show up at Cooper Union. And out of that gathering rises the Women's Central Association of Relief. And out of that organization comes the US Sanitary Commission, the most important civilian organization of the war. So you can draw a straight line from the Blackwells living room to the US Sanitary Commission if you want to. The Blackwells emerged as the leaders of the committee in charge of identifying and training women to serve as nurses at the front. They throw themselves into this effort and then are quickly frustrated and dismayed by the reception that they have. It turns out that New York's male physicians are not particularly interested in working alongside female physicians as colleagues. The Blackwells find that their own infirmary is excluded from the hospitals that are going to serve as training locations for the women who will serve as nurses, which is a little ridiculous. Meanwhile, down in Washington, Dorothea Dix is given the main leadership role. She is not a healthcare professional in any way. They call her the meddler in chief, and eventually withdraw their support from the war effort in dismay and frustration, and turn their efforts to a new project, an ironic new project. The Blackwells had always spoken against female medical education, saying that it was inferior and that the products of those female medical colleges were mediocre. But because of the existence of the female medical colleges in mostly Philadelphia and Boston, and now there was one in New York as well, those inferior places were turning out inferior graduates, but none of the men's colleges were letting women come in because there was this alternative. So the Blackwells changed their minds and decided to open their own women's medical college, but make it more rigorous than even the programs they had themselves attended. So that's what they did. They opened the Women's Medical College of the New York Infirmary in 1869. It was a longer duration, 3 terms instead of 2. Courses that built on each other instead of repeating. Much more emphasis on practical instruction at the bedside, which they could do because they had their own infirmary. As you can see, the way it worked back then was the way you paid tuition to medical school was that you bought a ticket to each professor's course of study. And these are some lecture tickets from the Women's Medical College. On the left, you can see Emily Blackwell's ticket for her course on obstetrics and diseases of women. And on the right, you can see a ticket for the courses of Mary Putnam Jacoby, who returned to help teach at the Women's Medical College. She taught materia medica, which is what was called pharmacology. I love looking at these tickets, and I'm very grateful to this student, Grace Peckham, who saved them all. They're all in the archives at Weill Cornell here in New York. Interestingly, having founded these institutions, Elizabeth and Emily then parted ways. So the story that I tell in the book pretty much ends right around the founding of the college. So that gives you the arc of their professional lives. Personally, their lives were just as fascinating. Both sisters adopted daughters. Emily, for the last several decades of her life, lived with a female partner and fellow surgeon, Elizabeth Cushier. 2 of their brothers married 2 of the most prominent feminists of the day, Lucy Stone, who was a prominent suffrage activist, and Antoinette Brown, who was the first woman in this country to be ordained as a minister. Elizabeth and Emily didn't agree with their sisters-in-law particularly. They were kind of out of step with the women's rights movement, which makes this story, adds a layer of complexity that attracted me as well. The Blackwells sisters weren't sure that suffrage should be the #1 priority of the women's rights movement. They thought that giving women the vote when they were still more likely to be told by their menfolk how to use it wasn't a useful move. That wasn't it more important to help women gain their ideological, financial, legal independence before you gave them a political tool? And they also disagreed with each other, Elizabeth and Emily. They had different ideas of the roles of women in healthcare. Elizabeth, because of the loss of her eye and because of her own sort of personality and natural inclinations, had moved more toward public health. She, after the founding of the infirmary, left for England, where she had always preferred to live, and spent the last 40 years of her life pursuing public health policy, moral reform, helping found the National Health Society, whose motto was "Prevention is better than cure." She really didn't see patients. She spent a lot more time writing and presenting, speaking, publishing, than healing people. Emily remained in New York to run the infirmary and the college for the next 40 years, very competently, brilliantly even. Her idea of what a woman in medicine should be was as competent as any man. She was a surgeon, she was an obstetrician, she was a medical professor. So that's the outline of the story. And I really feel like this particular moment is a good one for the Blackwell story, which is not a conventional feminist trailblazer kind of story. The aptness of this story for this moment for me is kind of summed up in this photograph, which I'll tell a story about to close with. This photograph comes up anytime you Google Elizabeth Blackwell. If you Google Elizabeth Blackwell and go to images, you will see this. It graces websites, at least one biography, films about her. It comes up all the time. This photo is not a photo of Elizabeth Blackwell. it's probably one of her nieces. How do I know this? Well, if you flip the photo over, you see that it was taken at Dana's Photo Portrait Gallery on 6th Avenue and 14th Street in New York. Dana's Photo Portrait Gallery was there pretty much in the mid 1880s, when Elizabeth Blackwell would have been in her mid 60s. This is probably one of her nieces. And it's interesting, when you look at the back of the card, you can see the little debate that the curators had at the Museum of the City of New York. Somebody wrote Bessie Blackwell at the top. Maybe that was one of the niece's nicknames. And someone helpfully underneath that wrote, "Oh, Elizabeth Blackwell, right, first woman doctor of modern times." And then the photo was cataloged as possibly Elizabeth Blackwell. Down below, though, another curator has written, probably not, since Dana is at 14th Street address circa 1885. So on the card itself is the proof that this couldn't possibly be Elizabeth Blackwell. It kind of makes me think of Elizabeth Bennet from Jane Austen, a young, dewy, sharp-witted young lady gazing at her future. But this photo brings home to me over and over again how we need our heroines to be often, how we want them to look, how we want them to feel. And I think it's really high time that we got over this, that the heroine doesn't need to be the fairy princess. The heroine can be the old wise woman that she consults along the way sometimes. And this moment, when we've just inaugurated our first female vice president, seems like a really important one for this lesson, that the Blackwells were not perky or pretty. They weren't interested in pleasing anyone. They were complicated and prickly and imperfect and very real heroines, the kind of women who change the world, even though not everything they do is necessarily admirable. I think that's a contradiction and a paradox that is really relevant to right now. I want to thank you for listening to this story, and I hope that we can further the conversation with some good questions.
Thank you, Janice. We really do appreciate that, and it's interesting to get a look at Elizabeth and Emily Blackwell in those 19th century portraits. Also to think especially about what you were saying about the sort of perky, plucky heroines that we often have who are similar to the young women depicted on those children's books with which you opened the talk. And just to actively think, maybe we'll circle back to actively think again about, who our heroines are now and who they might be, who the younger ones are among us right now. I'm going to wait for some questions to roll in. I think people were caught up in your story, but I was making some notes along the way. And one of my thoughts has to do with, so when the Blackwells became the proprietors of that infirmary, and it was for indigent women and children, what kinds of things might they have introduced into the care of women and children in that establishment that simply wasn't the standard of the time?
The most innovative thing they were doing was around the issues of hygiene. One of the things that they did in the hospital was when these young female medical graduates would come to them for practical training, sometimes they weren't working in the infirmary. They were being deployed as what were called sanitary visitors out into the neighborhoods, into the tenements, to meet poor women in their home settings and teach them about hygiene, about prenatal care, about parenting ideas. This was new, and this was very much in line with Elizabeth's idea of a woman doctor as a teacher armed with science. She really was much more interested in those ideas than Emily was more the one who was at the infirmary doing the surgeries. They also were, very wary. This was the end, the high water mark and the end of what was known as heroic medicine, right? Before diagnostic tools were known, a lot of what medical practice involved was recognizing that something was wrong and then trying to get it out, whether that was through bleeding or blistering or emetics or enemas. Elizabeth and Emily were very wary of a lot of the harshness of this kind of medicine, lots of use of mercury and laudanum. And so a lot of what they did involved cold water and fresh air, which I think the neighborhood folk were often kind of wary of at first and then realized that they were getting some results. They were trying to turn public opinion away from these really questionable practices that doctors had always used because they were doctors and you were supposed to trust them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We have some questions rolling in now. A couple of them have to do with the infirmary as well, but also with the Blackwell sisters themselves. So how was the care at the infirmary funded if this was for indigent?
Right. Donations. So I think a lot of the women who might not have been ready to consult a female physician still understood the progressive and forward thinkingness of the Blackwells' mission. And some of them were their patients, Quakers, freethinkers, people who were thinking a little bit outside of the mainstream, but were still part of the upper middle class of New York society. Became their donors, and their board was stacked with prominent names, people like Horace Greeley, who was the founding editor of the New York Tribune, prominent folk who were thinking a little bit outside the box and supported them financially. And then also, once they were underway, the state as well supported the infirmary, as it supported all medical institutions that were public.
Mm-hmm. And how did they support themselves? Out of that same pool of donations, or
they did have a smaller handful of private patients that they received fees from, and then they also got some support from their family, their brothers, who I think in that initial orphaned moment in the late 1830s in Cincinnati, it was the older daughters who had kind of rescued the family and saved it from penury. As the brothers who were in the middle of the pack came of age and went to work, I think there was a significant amount of gratitude toward their older sisters that led them to really support their unusual professional goals. They always had some, and one of the brothers at least was quite successful in real estate, so there was some extra support coming from there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned earlier the role of Margaret Fuller in American society and culture in the early 19th century. So how did the Blackwells fit into the religious context of the mid 19th century? You also mentioned some of their patients included Quakers and other freethinkers.
Right. Well, their father back in England, they had come from a dissenting family, a family of dissenting from the Church of England. So already outside of the mainstream, iconoclastic family when it came to religious matters. When they got to America, Elizabeth and her sisters and her brothers to a certain extent they spent a lot of time seeking. They kind of tried out a lot of things, were very drawn to the Unitarians and the Transcendentalists. In the end, I think Emily was a less explicitly spiritual person. Elizabeth was definitely a spiritual person, but tended to make her own rules. I wouldn't say she was a member of any congregation because her own idealistic guideposts were so much loftier than other people's. But I think the roots of her attitudes were more Unitarian than anything else, I would say.
Mm-hmm. We have some questions as well, coming back to your particular interest in this project. What got you started in it? And you alluded early on to the fact that, like so many people who enter college, you were pre-med, and you thought that was the direction you were going. What prompted that sharp turn into the humanities, and then this circling back to a medical topic?
Right. Well, I mean, I got to college, I was being a little disingenuous. I'm a class A bookworm from early on as well. So English was always in there. I think, I finished high school in the 80s at a girls' school that was proudly oriented toward the humanities. And I don't think I was I don't think I was ready for college level science and the way it's taught. I think it's a very different picture now. I'm watching my own daughter in her own pre-med studies. She hit college much readier to tackle science education at college, which can be not a comfortable place, a very competitive and grueling kind of project. I also happened to find myself at a university with a fabulous English department, and so it was very hard to resist. And I didn't really have a sense that I could do both the way I think the idea of interdisciplinary work wasn't quite as clear then as it is now. So I swerved, but I always retained that passionate interest in science, and this was a wonderful way to circle back to it, and combine my interest in storytelling and 19th century border crossing women with a medical story, and get to spend a whole lot of time looking at 19th century practice and leeches and crazy instruments. It's a pretty gothic horror show in 19th century medicine often.
Mm-hmm. I appreciated what you said about the Royal College of Surgeons Museum in Edinburgh. I've been there, and it's an astonishing place and something of a harrowing experience to look at some of what is there and read the labels. We have a question too about to what extent did Emily and Elizabeth Blackwell, as their practice years extended, to what extent did they keep up with the current progress in science and its applications in medicine? To what extent did they incorporate that? I guess it would be more into Emily's practice.
Yeah, well, they were different. Emily, it's true, was very interested in what was new. She was very interested in surgical technique, in finding better solutions to problems, and she really was avidly interested in that. Elizabeth, I don't know whether it was temperamentally or because she was just ever so slightly older. Some of the innovation was hard for her to accept. The idea that that moral behavior had nothing to do with health, that an amoral microbe would cause venereal disease. That was hard for her, that the idea that right behavior didn't have anything to do with right living. She found that difficult. She found vaccination hard because she had an experience where she had vaccinated an infant who died. And she was horrified by the idea that she had meddled with a life and caused its end. And that seemed against God's plan to her. She always included prayer and God's will in a more explicit way in her idea of health than Emily did. Emily was much more likely to innovate. She brought fistula surgery, for instance, to the infirmary, and worked to improve it, not to learn it and then to make it even better. So they did have these divergent attitudes, which is, I think, why, with some relief, they parted ways and lived on different continents for the last 40 years of their lives.
So how has your study of the Blackwells and their work and their imperfections and their differences, as you were just explaining, how have those factors affected how you view some of the criticisms of our modern day heroines and women, including, figures in business and politics and academia? I mean, we're seeing, you changes.
Right. And it's very difficult because, cancel culture. If you transgress in certain ways, there are many voices who will rise against you. The Blackwells are interesting to me because, Elizabeth liked to say she was too conservative for the progressives and too progressive for the conservatives. She was doing something that was horrifying to the establishment entering medicine. But once she'd entered, she wasn't leading the charge on things like birth control. She thought abortion was a sin. And again, she wasn't all that interested in women getting the vote right up front. When she went to college at Geneva, New York, which was a stone's throw from Seneca Falls, where the first women's rights convention was. She referred to it as that Rochester absurdity. She wasn't interested in joining forces with those women. She wasn't interested in lending her name to theirs. She could be quite misogynist when it came to her opinion of other women. And I found all of that incredibly familiar. And I think it's very much a part of our culture and our lives right now. And I think it's something that people don't always look squarely at, the fact that accomplished women don't always support other women. And this idea that you can do something incredibly admirable and breathtakingly, triumphantly, some breathtaking achievement, and you can also hold another opinion that isn't so attractive. And the idea that we need to work on being able to hold those kinds of contradictions in our minds, and not just reject, is important to me. I think it's important right now if we're going to make progress and listen to each other and hear each other, not to just shut down when something comes up that isn't in line with what we believe.
So thinking about the medical school they founded, how long did that last, and what happened to it? Was it absorbed into another
Right. So
institution,
it was great.
Co-ed, or did it go co-ed?
Right. I mean, as I said, they hadn't intended to found a women's medical college. What they did was they founded a women's medical college designed to kind of be a placeholder until the mainstream medical colleges figured out how to move into the future. So Emily ran the women's medical college from 1869 until 1899.
Wow.
At which point institutions like Johns Hopkins and Cornell began to admit women. And as soon as that was the case, she announced that she was going to shut it down because there was no reason for it anymore. The remaining students in the year that she shut it down were invited to continue and finish their studies at Cornell, which was in New York City. But it was very explicitly, it has served its purpose and now it will close. The infirmary remained for a century and was then absorbed later into Weill Cornell and New York Presbyterian, and still exists in its DNA still exists in Lower Manhattan Hospital. But the college, as soon as women were welcome, to some degree at least, in these elite male institutions, they shut it down.
Well, it's interesting to think about, because yes, things technically became more open, but I'm also thinking about the pioneering woman you were on the program with last night, Vivian Pinn, who in the class of 1967 here at the University of Virginia, she was not only the only African-American in the class, but also the only woman in her class. And I think she was only the second African-American woman to graduate from UVA Medical School. So,
right.
Yeah.
It was an incredible honor to meet her last night. She is an extraordinary person. But yes, I mean, it was not a linear progression from 1899.
No.
Anyway.
Well, we will close here, but thank you so much, Janice Nimura, for joining us today, for introducing us to the sisters, the Doctors Blackwell. And we hope you have many more readers out there. Please join us next week for a program on LGBTQ inclusive hospice and palliative care, transforming practice, with Kim Aquaviva from UVA and Tim Short from Hospice of the Piedmont. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks.